on your, there you go, to let you know. So welcome everyone to our wildcard Connect Lounge for the Landscape Ontario peer-to-peer network. We call this the wildcard because once a month we hold one of these sessions in our Zoom virtual lounge at different times of the week and of the day, hoping that we can connect with different people once a month. And we also have a Connect Lounge meeting on the first Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. every month. And so we thought we would have two a month, and one of them is a floating wild card. And I will post after this meeting, after every wild card, we post when the next one will be next month. So please go to the Hort Trades website and the peer-to-peer network page, which you can find through the training tab. And to see when the dates are for upcoming events. We will have Grant Harrison coming to talk to us in the Business Bite series on the first Wednesday of July at 9 a.m. And those are on the Hort Trades website. So you're welcome to sign up for them and hope to see you there. And so today, Blake Tubby, who's one of our members from Toronto, he posted a great question on our Facebook private lounge feed and asked about vaccines. And he asked the question about, he has an employee or two on his teams that are choosing not to have a vaccine at all for COVID-19. And so he has some other staff who have concerns around that with respect to working in close proximity with one another. And so Blake sort of put the question out there looking for advice, and he actually asked Dominic, he asked you to chime in. And so I said, okay, stay tuned, I'll go find Dominic. And that's how I reached you the other day. So as facilitator of this peer network, it's up to me to help drive the discussion, drive the conversation. And so I tend to try to mine the topics for our Connect Lounge meetings, rather from Jackie's brain and Jackie's experience and what's on Jackie's mind and what Jackie thinks is on your minds. I try to mine it directly from the peer feed. So we're going to focus on that question today. So Amiri, who's a legal expert with EIO Solutions, and Dominic Rikiki, who has been wonderful to speak at many of our and be a part of many of our peer connect sessions so far, and who's going to be speaking in November at the Business Bite series. So Amiri, I'm going to just open it up and ask for you to give us a little, maybe the Coles Notes version to start with, of where do we sit as employers with vaccinations, protecting employees and customers who are expecting our staff to be vaccinated, and employees who are choosing not to be vaccinated. Where do we sit as employers?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jackie, for being so welcoming. And as always, a big thank you to Dominic for bringing us together. Now, I'm going to try and do this as simply as I can. I'm going to try to avoid the fancy legal mumbo jumbo language that all lawyers like to use, and really keep it plain and simple, right? So, of course, as employers, we have a duty to primarily our employees, right? And the duty that we have to our employees is to ensure that they have a safe working environment, a safe place where they can come to work without the fear of being exposed to any dangers. Now, prior to 2020, that was most often focused on what we call WIB types of issues, falling off a ladder, making sure we have appropriate wash basins to wash stuff off out of our eyes, off of our hands. But of course, now since 2020, that has mutated and it's become something more serious. And the obligations, though, remain the same. The obligation of the employer is to ensure the safety of its employees up to due hardship, right? Or to a reasonable extent. So we've been faced with the question quite a bit, Dominic and I, coming from the employers who we service, which is this. My duty is to protect my workers. Of course, The easiest way to protect workers in the context of COVID and to ensure that they don't contract COVID would be to have everybody vaccinated. That stands to reason. That is the simplest way of doing that. So we've been faced with the question of, okay, how do I get that done, Dominic or Amiri, or how can I get that done? And I am going to focus first on the issue of vaccinations. Then I'm going to look at other things such as COVID. So on the issue of vaccinations themselves, you cannot force an employee to take a vaccine. That is the position of the law as it stands right now. Will this be changing at some point in time? Will there be some legislation to this effect? Perhaps, but not very likely. The way I'm going to discuss this is by analogy, okay? So of course, there are lots of individuals, some of whom may be in the room, who for various reasons choose not to have their children vaccinated, right? That's not something recent. That's been something that's been in the public realm for, at least the last 20 years, right? And so what we can look to for guidance on this is really the immunization of school pupils legislation, for example, which requires, of course, children who are attending public schools and gathering, mixing with others to be vaccinated, right? But that law doesn't mandate vaccinations. And the reason it doesn't do so is, or the reason it has exemptions, is because there are certain people for conscientious or religious reasons or just previous medical history who should not be taking the vaccine as it is not safe for them. So there is always that exemption at law. And that exemption will likely be in place forever and with respect to all vaccinations. So looking at it in the context of COVID, you could, as an employer, strongly encourage your employees to get vaccinated. But those same exemptions that exist with respect to school children will exist with respect to adults. You will not be able to force an adult to take a vaccine if their medical history suggests that they shouldn't, or if for religious reasons they can't take a vaccine, or for conscientious reasons. And the reason that is so is because you will be violating their human rights, right? You will be saying that a person has to take a vaccine, and this has to apply across the board, regardless as to race, ethnicity, religious reasons, or pre-existing medical conditions, which is a violation of human rights law. So that being said, you cannot mandate that they take it, but you can encourage them to take it with the view of this is going to make the workplace safer. So that is the issue of vaccinations. Now, what I also want to touch on, Jackie, and everyone else who's here, is I want to touch on the issue of, okay, well, I can't get them vaccinated, Amiri, but can I require them to be tested, right? Now, this one is not even as cut and dry as the example that I just gave you. There's still, of course, no one has challenged this in the court as yet, to my knowledge. So we're operating from a position where we don't have case law on this, but we can relate it to the general obligation to make a workplace safe. And again, that duty or that obligation on the employer is to make the workplace safe using all reasonable means and measures and not infringing upon anybody's right. So what you can say is you can make testing available. Yeah, you can offer the testing, but what the law would suggest is that before you require a test, there are other measures that you can take to ensure the safety of your workplace. And those measures are the measures that were put in place last year as they relate to things like, okay, screening policies, everybody coming into your workplace, everybody working under your banner, whether they're physically in your office or whether you're going on site to accomplish some task, you should every single day require those people to be screened. And they're rather they're measures which aren't invasive that can allow you to do that, right? You're not impacting upon anybody's right to privacy if you put a temperature machine, thermometer, gun, I don't know what we call it, to their head and require them to not have that high fever. You can ask them whether they've traveled. You can ask them all of the screening questions. Have they been exposed to someone who may have traveled or who may have COVID, and go through those usual screening measures. And what the law is suggesting is that that is enough right now for you to avoid liability, right? Once you go through the appropriate screening measures, of course, it's even better if you can have tests available, but you cannot force an employee to take the test, especially because still at this point, right? I know we have rapid tests, et cetera, and the test procedures are evolving, but it's still a rather invasive test. I would assume that many of us in this room have sat through the discomfort of that. I certainly have on 2 or 3 occasions. I know Dominic has. So it's not fun, and we can't quite require that. But what we can do, what we should do in every single circumstance, is continue our daily screening process. And what the law is saying is that that is sufficient in its nature once we're making sure it's done to avoid any legal liability. Now, there may be people in the room like me who my office requires me every day to fill out a screening form. I'm going to be entirely honest with everyone here. I don't do it every day. Sometimes I come in on the Friday and I do the entire week's worth in one sitting. That's not how we should be doing it as employers, right? We should definitely be mandating that all employees do it on a daily basis, and we keep records of it just in case there's a checkup on us, right?
Amiri,
Yes.
Amiri, I'm just going to ask you to pause there for 1 second.
Of course.
Because this is great information. Joe, can I just ask you to chime in here for a sec? Is there an app, a screening app? Did I see you?
It's not an app, but what I did create was a Google form based on the province's screening questions. And so we've kept that template up to date so that members can have open access to that. So that's available on the Landscape Ontario website, so hortrades.com. And if you go to the COVID-19 employer resources, the template is there.
Okay, can you just post the link to that in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, let me grab it and I'll post it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, Amiri, I just wanted to pause at that point because I was pretty sure there was something that Joe had mentioned before. Brian Cotter, go ahead, and then David Morris has a question. Amiri, we'll pause and take a couple questions here. Brian Cotter first, please.
So the comment about taking temperature reading with the temperature guns or whatever the heck these devices you want to call them are.
Yeah.
Infrared thermometer.
I don't know the official name.
From someone's head, there's been research published and shown that long-term can cause damage. It's medically suggested to do it from the wrist.
Yeah.
So would it not be wise to speak to that instead of saying from someone's head in a discussion like this?
Yes, for sure, right? Either is acceptable. My research has shown that they're both equally accurate, right? I would certainly suggest that if you're doing it, you do it right on the wrist, like you said, Ryan. That's the safest way of doing it, right? Because of course, some people are going to have concerns, right? I mean, this is all new to all of us. So yes, I would suggest that in those instances, Brian, take it on the wrist. Right? Not everybody is aware of the concerns that you have raised, but I feel like as employers, it's our duty and our responsibility to put that information out there and to educate our staff and really the general public as best as we can. And yes, I would certainly suggest that wrist is the best place to do it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I just felt when that just was mentioned earlier, we don't want to mislead the membership, because I've seen medical reports come back because somebody in our office did challenge it and showed me a report. I did some research and spoke to a couple of doctors, and they said absolutely do it from the wrist. It's definitely not suggested from the head. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that. As leaders, we should be making sure we're protecting our people as much as we can.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. And then David, you had a question.
I was going to, it's almost more of a clarification, having gone through several COVID tests, including the one you were referring to, which basically drills to the back of your skull and takes a portion of your brain out to be tested, which is a horrible experience. The new rapid testing, you take a Q-tip yourself and rim it around the inside of your lower nostril. It's so non-invasive as to be ridiculous. So first off, there is testing, which is not hard to go through. I'd like if you could please address, and I'm sure it's a concern of all of us, it's certainly a concern of mine. If you have people who are refusing to be vaccinated for whatever reason, I strongly suspect there will be at least a portion of time where they're not going to be allowed on certain properties. I'm not quite sure how the transition is going to happen. Me personally, I'm hoping that what they're going to say is, regardless of whether you've had 2 vaccinations or not, you still have to wear a mask and you still have to socially distance for a period of time until we get the rate down to such a point that we're not worried about it anymore, because there are people out there who will lie. They are completely convinced you're violating their human rights and you're an agent of Satan, making them wear a mask. I'm sure they don't wear a seatbelt in their car or a life jacket in the boat either, you know, because God forbid. So can you give us some advice on, as an employer who has an employee who is compromised in a way, because you can't violate his human rights, you can't make him get a vaccine, but he's not going to be allowed on certain properties, which is going to affect our workflow. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations?
Yeah, I do have a couple of suggestions there for you, David. Now, of course, you started by saying that you're operating from a position where you're not quite sure and you don't know. That is everybody else. Anybody who tells you that they completely know the answer to this is, well, you should take that with a bucket of salt and not a grain, right? Exactly, right? Now, we are going to run into that problem. That is an inevitable issue. Let's say from our end, and let's deal with it from 2 perspectives. First, the perspective of working in our office. Let's say I have a warehouse and they need to be in the warehouse. I can control that to a certain extent by, again, doing the usual screening that we would do in any event. And still, I would still, like you said, insist upon social distancing and masks, right? In fact, that is the most recent information we're getting from the government, that regardless, these positions are going to hold through. And that's the same position in the UK, because I've been monitoring their opening up very, very closely. And while they had originally said, hey, look, June 21, things are going to be reopened, things are reopening, but still there's the requirement for social distancing, right? We can control all of that in our workplace, but what happens if we're going on site and the owner of the site is saying, hey, look, these people aren't fully vaccinated. I do not want this particularly employee who you sent me to be on site. That's the bigger issue, right? And it's a much bigger problem because it's not one that we can completely control. But still, as the employers, we have a duty to our employees. So what I've been suggesting in situations like that, where we're going to somebody else's home, somebody else's property to work, we have to be very honest and upfront without disclosing too much. We can just simply say, hey, we have our workers here. Our workers are screened. We are not allowed to enforce a mandatory vaccination. But what we can do is, in the interim, operate as if we were back in June of 2020 and not June 2021, right? So we're going to make sure we have all of our PPE available, which, remember, is still always the duty and obligation of the employer, right? So whether we're working in-house or whether we're going off-site, we are the ones who have to supply that to our employees. So all we can do in those instances is make sure that social distancing is followed appropriately, make sure that they wear masks. Even better, we make sure they wear gloves, and we appropriately social distance. If it is that you're working off-site for a client and a client has a certain hesitance or a reluctance to allow a person to work within a certain, well, then that's a discussion that we have to have with our employee and explain to them, this is not our fault. We did not do this. All we can do is ensure that the appropriate safety measures are met. But ultimately, if a client says they don't feel comfortable with one of the people working there, we may have to pull them off site, right? And move them to another comparable job or comparable location so that they're not prejudiced.
Mary, another question that has come up a lot, especially through phone calls to the Landscape Ontario office from members, asking if they can, and I know that Dominic, we addressed this at a town hall recently as well, separating employees that are vaccinated versus those that are not. That's come up very often.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. That one is one of the tricky ones, because that one too, if you start to isolate or group persons, you're naturally treating them differently, right? One of the old analogies we go to in the law always is back in the 1960s in the US, where the civil rights movement was really getting started. And they said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have separate schools for Black kids and separate schools for white kids, but they're going to be equal. That's a fiction. You can't be separate and equal, right? You got to be equal across the board, and you got to treat everybody in the same way. So you cannot pick and choose or allow persons who are not vaccinated. You can't say, okay, everyone who's not vaccinated operates over here, everyone who's vaccinated operates over here, because then you're naturally prejudicing. Even if they're working a similar type of job on a similar type of site, we cannot exercise that type of discretion, because what you're doing there is you're isolating a certain individual by saying this is an individual who has not been vaccinated, and so we're not allowing you to do certain things or work amongst certain people. So that is definitely a no-go. The only thing, now of course, that doesn't necessarily help you. The answer you want from Amiri is, okay, well, what do I tell the employees? Or what do I tell anybody else who's here? And what you have to tell them at all points in time is, hey, look, if you are vaccinated, well then, and you've gone through the requisite period, you've had your second shot, and maybe it's 2 weeks after the second shot, your fear should be lessened. You are not as easily going to get the disease as someone who has not been vaccinated. So for the persons who are vaccinated, your fear is lessened. But also, the fear for those who are not vaccinated is also lessened, or the possibility of harm to them is also lessened, if you have a community whereby maybe, at least 50-40% of your workforce has been vaccinated. So it's really one of those things where the more we get vaccinated, hopefully, by October, we really get those numbers in terms of vaccinations up. It really works for everybody, and there's no prejudice to anyone. And what it does is it completely relieves the obligation upon you to keep a safe workplace, right? But what it also does is, or what we should also be doing in the interim, as we were just discussing with Brian, is still ensuring that we maintain appropriate social distancing and the wearing of PPE until the government advises us otherwise. And I know many people's trust in the government is shaken at this point in time. Certainly mine has ebbed and flowed and gone up and down. But what I would be suggesting is that even after we get that mandate, there's still certain things that we should be doing as employers to keep people safe, and just generally as a community. For instance, not necessarily a legal opinion on my part, but I certainly feel as though 3 people in an elevator is something that we should probably stick to. We should probably still insist on people washing their hands regularly when we get out of this. I just think that those are good practices that keep everybody safe.
Okay. Paul Barker, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I know you're probably out on a site somewhere. So does anyone else, are there any other questions, first of all? Natalie or Heather, Paul, do any of you, or Brian, David, do you have additional questions for Amiri before we move on to in the discussion? Brian, you had your hand up.
I don't know if it's so much of a question, but I'd like to just I'd like to say something and then get some feedback from Mary.
Sure.
I think as leaders, as professional, strong leaders, we need to keep in mind both sides to this vaccine. It is important that more and more people get vaccinated, so it does help control COVID. However, it is an experimental drug with 0 liabilities to anybody who's making this drug and supplying it. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And if somebody feels sensitive where they don't want to partake or can't partake, we need to respect that wishes for now. And if we're following all protocols, social distancing, washing hands, wearing masks, and all that sort of thing, we are doing our due diligence as leaders to make sure the teams are following those things, which really is not a negotiable.
Yes.
We really shouldn't be trying to enforce or have the mindset that we're enforcing something that we're not allowed to. We need to be cognizant of that. Where I've heard some owners on a band, like they're going to force their people to do it or they're out. Like, you got to keep in mind as a leader, you have to look at all the facts. You should not be doing that as a leader. You got to respect the whole story, not one-sided. And as you mentioned just a little while ago, more and more people get vaccinated. If 2 out of the 3 people on the crew are vaccinated, it lessens everybody's chance. And just because you're vaccinated does not mean you will not get COVID.
Exactly.
It does not mean that you cannot pass it on. It increases your chance of having a much less severe case of it, much less severe case. So, I mean, that's really the advantages right now until they get past the experimental stage, which is going to take history and data to do that. I think as leaders, we need to keep an open mind on this whole thing and make sure we're looking at all avenues to protect both our teams and the public.
Well said, Brian. And I just like to piggyback on that. One of the worst things that has happened during this pandemic, and it's one of those problems that's an underlying problem always, is the way people just divide themselves into factions, right? Everybody who is in favor of getting the vaccine is a left-wing sympathizer and a gullible puppy who follows the government. And everybody who doesn't want to get the vaccine is a right-wing conspiracy theorist and a nut job, right? It's almost like we've divided ourselves into these 2 camps with the name calling and the insistence upon a certain course of action. So I definitely agree with you. We as leaders and employers, and this is one of the things that Dominic and I often touch on, is we have to be sensitive to our messaging, right? We don't want to use messaging that's alienating people, especially when we're existing in a realm right now where so many things are uncertain. I don't know who can say things with 100% certainty as it comes to the transmission or contracting of the virus. And so that's one of the things I want to advise everybody in this room of, is there's a difference between insisting upon a safe place and just downright calling people names. I mean, of course, my preference is that everybody goes out there and gets vaccinated, but my messaging is always that this is designed for the safety of you as an employee, and it's not meant to be inflammatory, and we're not saying anything inflammatory, right? And so I would advise all employers, regardless as to your own rules or your own thinking, let's stick with what we know for sure at this point in time, which is that we have an obligation to keep everybody safe. And there are ways that we can take, or there are measures we can take to ensure that everybody's safe without having to point fingers at anybody, right?
Right. I think that's a great point. It is important to make sure that safety stays at the forefront of everyone's mind. And as Brian says, as leaders, we have to be respectful of everyone in our company and on our team, and whether or not you're left wing or right wing or way left wing or somewhere in the middle shouldn't impact an employee's willingness to come to work.
Yes.
Whether they're in the I'm vaccinated camp or the I'm never going to get vaccinated camp. And so I think some important points have come up here. I am going to make one comment that someone said to me the other day, and I thought, actually, I think it was Mark Green from this peer group that said this, not to confuse the vaccination with an inoculation. Because a lot of people think, oh, I'm vaccinated, that's it. There's no way I'm going to get, it's not a polio, it's not, it's not an inoculation that will prevent you from ever getting COVID-19. It's a vaccination. And many of us have had a flu shot and then got the flu.
Yes.
Because there's a variant of the flu that circulates around that wasn't, our immune system wasn't triggered on with our flu shot. which is a vaccination. So I think it's important because I'm seeing with some of my clients, some of my consulting clients, asking some of these similar questions, that there is a camp where we're vaccinated, so we're better than you. We're vaccinated, and we're now, superheroes, and we've got the cape of protection. And
Yep.
There's some, strutting about, so to speak. But I think it's important to stay really grounded here as employers, to stay, as Brian says, as leaders, like stay really grounded and remember that a vaccination, and we're seeing every week different variants popping up here, there, and
Yes.
everywhere. And you can go to the website and see how many cases of which variant is in Ontario on any given day. And so, did you get Moderna? Did you get AstraZeneca as the first one, and then Pfizer as a second? And what do the studies show? And we don't know yet. This is all
We don't
gonna,
know.
This is all going to be rearview mirror stuff a year or two from now to see how well this all rolled out. So we're living an experiment, and there are some cohorts within the experiment that are choosing to be the control and not getting the vaccination, and some who are choosing to travel and throw caution to the wind, and others who are being very careful and cautious. And so there's a broad mix here. So I think remaining respectful and remaining grounded and not getting pulled into one side or the other, but to stay, Amiri, as you pointed out, focused on what are my legal obligations as an employer? How will I provide that within the culture, signature, and the DNA of my company?
Yes.
What is the expectation of my employees with respect to me protecting them from harm? And how do we make sure that, I think it's important to make sure that the messaging, as Brian said, around health and safety in your own company, when you have momentum and a health and safety culture, I don't think there should be, huge alarm bells and big exceptional stuff around COVID at this point. A year ago, yes. 6 months ago, yes. But now I think it should be a part of your health and safety culture, a part of your daily processes, your daily procedures, your routine daily screening, and or the infrared thermometer, if that's one of your screening tools, masks, PPE, social distancing. It needs to become part of the company's health and safety slipstream, and I think at this stage we need to be careful and make a really big effort to not sensationalize it anymore.
Yes.
This is 15 months in, and probably another 6 or who knows how many more to go. So I think we need to really focus and work hard on not sensationalizing or staying in that place of fear and staying in that place of worrying about things changing next week. It's okay. We're learning. We're living the experiment. And I think it's an important role that we all have to keep each other calm and stay grounded. So that's my
Yes.
advice.
If I can add just a couple of things, Jackie.
Sure, Dominic.
One is we talked about, we're talking about health and safety and PPE and the checks and stuff like that. One important aspect of COVID protocols, let's call it, would be sanitizing and cleaning equipment, vehicles, things like that. That's the one area where what I'm finding clients don't spend enough time doing. They're doing the distancing. Yeah, here's a mask, and they're just leaving it at that. So I just want to remind everyone that making sure that everyone has sanitation for their hands and clean the tools and spray sanitizer in the vehicles. That's equally as important, and make sure that you keep doing that. And just to add on what Brian and yourself said, Jackie, is what's really important right now is, and we've talked about this in other peer groups, is the culture of the company. That's what's going to drive your company to be successful. Be very careful of taking a right turn and basically saying, okay, now, no, I'm demanding everyone's got to take vaccines.
Well said, Dominic.
Right, that could really upset your culture. It could reduce your employee engagement. So be very careful how you treat the situation so you keep your company moving forward and maintaining that positive culture. that's me with my HR hat on.
No, that's really, really valuable. I think it's, I'm going to ask Dominic, actually, being sort of, I'm going to say, on the front line of HR management, what sort of questions is your team getting most often, and what are seems to be the sources of friction that you're hearing about most often within the companies that you are working with?
I was speaking to Amiri yesterday and someone else today. The biggest question that I'm getting, I would say over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, give or take, and it's on a daily basis, is exactly what we're talking about today. Can I force my employees to take vaccines?
Okay.
And I think it's stemming from, again, we covered it, is I have some employees who are anti-vaxxers. I have some who are very diligent, like, no, we have to get vaccines. And it's just creating that divide.
Right.
And employers are sitting back going, okay, I got a business to run here, guys. Right? We have to find a way to work together and keep the company going, et cetera, et cetera. That's the biggest frustration, I think, is what I'm finding from employers, because employees are divided because of their beliefs or whatever the case may be. Right?
I think it tests the limits of the strength of a company culture, company health and safety culture, because no one questions whether or not they wear steel-toed boots to work as a personal protective equipment. Nobody questions whether or not they wear earmuffs and hearing protection when they're using a backpack blower, or wearing safety glasses when they're using a string line trimmer or a chainsaw. Like, nobody questions the validity of that personal protective equipment. I think where the challenge here is, some people are perceiving the vaccine as personal protective equipment.
Yes, you're 100% right, because now what's in the back of people's mind is that you're not vaccinated, I'm gonna catch COVID from you.
Right.
What Brian said earlier is that, I think it was Brian, or maybe Amiri, I can't remember, but if you're vaccinated, it doesn't mean you can't get it. You can still get it, right? The vaccine is designed for people to get as sick. So I think now what's happening is that, I'm not going to look at Jackie and go, she's not wearing her safety shoes, because if you're not wearing it, it doesn't affect me at all. Because if something falls, I got mine on, right? That's the issue. That's what the divide is. And again, it goes back to the culture. How do you deal with that? How do you maintain that health and safety culture or the overall culture, right? And what I've been helping clients do and been telling clients to do is follow the COVID protocols. There's a lot of great material on government websites where you can print off posters, hand them to your staff to make sure that they're educated properly, and encouraging them to get the vaccine. That's all we can do, but always push forward your policies, procedures, enforce them, and that's what you need to do, right?
Paul, thanks, Dominic. Paul Barker, who's on a site somewhere in Vaughan, maybe. There he is in his truck. He's just posted, for some, there are too many unknowns to be comfortable. They aren't necessarily anti-vaxxers. They just don't have all the details. Paul, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I'm not vaccinated. I'm not anti-vaxxer. My wife is vaccinated. My son is vaccinated. I encouraged my son to get vaccinated. I will get vaccinated, but at this point, I can maintain safe distance. We wear masks anytime we're around people. I tell my clients to stay back. Don't go in their houses. We're getting people converted to Wi-Fi controllers so we can access things remotely. I do tons of research on anything all the time, and there's too much contradictory information out there for me to be comfortable on either side of the fence. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm not a pro. I'm right in the middle, and it's really been, I've been struggling with this because I've been reading the posts on the page and I haven't commented, and I'm not going to force my employees to get it because I don't have the answers, and I can't say you have to have it. because don't have it, and I don't have it because I'm not comfortable with the answers.
So Paul, there's a portion here. So we are recording this, and I will post the recording on the peer page. So there was a bit of context that you missed in the first 15 minutes or so from Amiri, who is a lawyer, a labor lawyer, and he works with Dominic. And Amiri did make it clear that you legally cannot force your employees to get a vaccine. Just so you have that context for yourself.
I gathered that.
But you'll be able to go back and listen to the first 20 minutes or so when you get home.
And just to follow up, Paul, I actually think that your position is a very reasonable position to have. I just wanted to touch on another base where you talk about doing your own research and following up, seeing what's available. I think for employers, one of the most important things that we must ensure that we do is we don't want to be a party to communicating misinformation, right? So this leads back to what Dominic was saying, what Brian was saying, comments from Joe, which relate to we are going to stick to what we know right now and what we can implement, right? And we know that we're legally obligated to maintain a safe working environment. And there's certain steps that I think we all agree upon, or certainly the government on a consultation with, the employers and all of the stakeholders. And those relate to the things like the PPE, the safe distancing, which, as you said, Paul, you're already maintaining, right? So I think we also have that duty to make sure that we spread information and we educate our employees. We just at all times want to stay away from the more contentious issues, right? And this goes back to, again, with Dominic, Brian, Paul, what we've all said is that there's certain things we know for certain, and there's certain things that we should keep in place, washing of the hands, the PPE, etc. If we stick to that and that messaging, we're going to be fine. But I think what is happening is a lot of people still, as Jackie mentioned, we're 15 months into this, but still at this point in time, there's still a lot of panic, right? And we get a problem, or we will have a problem when we run into instances where employers are swept up in the panic and enforcing things that aren't necessary or aren't legal.
Excellent, well said, especially with the aren't legal part. I'm wondering if, Amiri, if you would be able to comment on just maybe in general, when a company does have a COVID positive test in within one of their employees, or two employees, let's say, can you talk about how or whether or not the employer's actions and responsibilities shift once there is a positive COVID case in a company?
Okay, I know that from a practical standpoint, I think Dominic has actually run into this instance before. Dominic, you have anything you want to add on that before I jump in?
Yeah, we've been dealing with that obviously since last year. What happens if you do have a positive case? And basically, kind of to piggyback what Amir was saying, is you follow what we know. So you follow the what the health department is requiring. So when you test positive, they have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So and that's what they do. So they're off your site. Then part of what you need to do in-house is you kind of have to see, okay, was that person in contact with someone else in close proximity for at least 15 minutes? If so, encourage them to go get a test as well. So this way you're not spreading it in your workplace, right? We've gone to the point where it has spread in a department where the whole department had to get tested. Whoever tested positive, quarantine, shut down the department, sanitize the whole department, and then you bring people in after their quarantine. So it's gone to that point. But those are pretty much the steps that I encourage everyone to take.
And just to follow up on that, well said, Dominic, thank you. I know Dominic has actually had the practical experience instead of me just sitting behind a chair and giving the advice. But of course, what we also want to make sure too is that when it comes to an employee who has contracted COVID and must remain now on leave for the requisite period or must remain in quarantine, we have to remember that we can't initiate acts of reprisal against them for that, right? We can't terminate the person for that. We just follow the guidelines. You have to go on quarantine, get a test, return, but we're not going to terminate in those instances. We are not going to punish them through suspension or any disciplinary action. I think, yes, while there might be some people who are needlessly reckless and exposing themselves to the virus, we can't really punish them on that basis, right?
I have had a question from clients, from one of my clients, where they knew that, and it's actually someone in this peer group, that one of their employees had a party, a house party. This was maybe 2 months ago, had a house party, and 2 other employees in the company were at the house party. There were no masks. It was an illegal event based on the stay-at-home order. And all 3 employees came into work the following Monday morning. And what is the employer's response? Does the employer have any responsibility there to manage the knowledge of that potential exposure or super spreader event, or whatever you want to call it?
Right. When it comes back to what we can do about that, it all relates directly to the things I was saying at the very start, right? From the time we get knowledge of that, all we can do at this point is insist upon screening, strongly encourage them to go and get tested as a result of this. However, not a whole lot more we can do with that.
Okay, that's what I thought, because it's what they're choosing to do on their own time. And as you say, putting themselves in harm's way at their choice.
Yes.
But it's certainly, in this particular company, it did raise a huge amount of concern among the other employees and put an enormous amount of pressure on the employer from the employees who did not engage in that behavior.
Of course.
They didn't want to be put at risk and put in, in proximity to people who blatantly were disregarding the stay-at-home order.
Yes.
It's a tough situation for employers to be in, right?
Very
Yeah,
tough.
but it's kind of like what Amin was saying at the very, very beginning. From an ethical and a legal standpoint, you want to treat everybody the same.
Yes.
So whether you're vaccinated or whether you're not, whether you believe in vaccinations, whether you don't, you all have to wear PPE. You all have to sanitize. You all have to socially distance. You have to clean your work environment. As Dominic was saying, some of us have gotten a little sloppy on that over the last year or so. But again, that is the best way to protect the company, the employees, and all of the employees and any of your clients. If you insist on equal treatment, and at least for probably the next year, insist that we abide by the rules that we have been this whole time along. And that's that way, because as you said, with anything like this, you get into political issues. Oh, I'm inoculated as opposed to vaccinated, and blah, blah, blah. And you can't mandate somebody's political, religious, or any views like that. All you can do is insist on fair and equal treatment that protects everybody.
Right. I think early on in the game here, about a year ago, LO, the creative department at LO invented the Don't Let Your Guard Down campaign. And there's the Don't Let Your Guard Down stickers and window clings and decals and whatever it is that's available, signs, posters. And we need a refresh, I think.
Yes.
Joe and Scott was here. Scott Barber was here. He's the communications manager for Landscape Ontario, or communications director. And I think it's not a bad idea, maybe, Joe, to think about ways in which LO could refresh that message, because we're still in it. And I actually was speaking to a contractor the other day who I said, and Brian, you'll laugh when I tell you this, because I had a marine source for 5-gallon pails of spray 9 last year. And Brian came and bought a few from me, and a few other people came and bought them, not from me, but straight from the marine source, because spray 9 is a product that they use to clean boats. And it was one of the few easily attained cleaners that were on the approved list of products that would sanitize or sterilize from COVID-19. And so everyone was using them on their tools. And I said to one fellow a couple of weeks ago, so how's your inventory of spray 9? Oh, we're not using that anymore. I said, what? Why not? Oh, well, like everyone's in the routine of things now. And I'm like, first thing I thought of was that don't let your guard down campaign. And we really, so I don't know, Amir or Dominic, or Joe, even if there's some advice or some input on employers' obligation to maintain all of those things that we started off doing, like last spring. Oh my gosh, I remember 12, 13 months ago, May 4th was the day our industry got to start up and go back to work, and for the most part, and everyone was just like, oh my God, how do we do this? And rejigging trailers and hand washing stations, right, Brian? And all sorts of different things were put into place. And I think some of that has started to slip away. So Amiri, I think from the point of employer liability, if especially, I would think, especially if those practices were in place a year ago and 9 months ago and maybe 6 months ago, but we've slipped back to old ways. Is there any sort of employer liability in some way that they had practices in place, and I guess because of the length or duration, they let it slip, and then someone gets COVID and they blame it on, well, like he coughed on the shovel and then I used the shovel. Like, I don't know. Any comment there?
Okay, I'll deal with it from the legal liability aspect, and then
Right.
I'll throw it back over to Dominic to talk about the practical day-to-day things that we can do. But from a legal perspective, what's important to appreciate and realize at all points in time is that I like that comment. It's called getting comfortable. That is absolutely correct, Paul. But the obligation is a continuing and ongoing obligation, right? As it is for anything related to the health and safety of your employees or just generally your workers. For instance, just by analogy, it's not enough to draft a health and safety work policy and keep it in a binder, right? You have to post the information in a conspicuous manner and place so that employees can see it, right? You have to remind it is a continuing obligation. It wasn't just good enough for us to put these things in place. We have to ensure that these measures are being followed, that employers are being made aware of these things, and they have knowledge of what they should be doing and what we are doing to insist to maintain a safe working environment. Dominic?
Yeah, I think Jackie, you hit the nail right on the head, because I wish I had a dollar for every time I walked into a client and I'm trying to sell my HR services and I ask them questions about health and safety. And one of the questions I would ask is, do you have a health and safety manual? And the owner would go behind them on the bookshelf, pull off a book and go, I got one right here, right? And that's the biggest problem, because in those cases, what's happened is that the Ministry of Labor has visited them. They've given them a whole bunch of orders. They created a manual, and then they're like, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it. And then it never gets done. The most important part of due diligence is the maintenance part. It's not developing or implementing, it's the maintenance. Because if you don't maintain it, you didn't do it.
Right.
And is there any advice, what have you? You just have to be on top of it. You have to make it into your daily or monthly or weekly routine to keep up with everything. Because I'm sure that everybody here and other LO members, they maintain their equipment, because God forbid your tractor breaks down because you're screwed. Same idea with everything else.
Right.
And that's how, that's how I try to get the point across. And that's, we like to get those systems in place. So on a regular basis, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Thanks, Dominic. And so Brian's just posted in the chat here. Brian, you're perfectly right. That don't, accountability, pure accountability, that there's a false sense of security from getting the vaccine. And that education through team meetings is key. And there's many companies that have that safety manual in April, show it to the staff in April at orientation, and then back on the shelf or in underneath the seat of the truck or into the console, and that's the end of it. So this, for sure, I want to make sure that we're encouraging all of our members to not let your guard down and to rewind 12 months ago. What were you doing relative to COVID and COVID protocols? Because it should be the same today as what it was 12 months ago when it was fresh and new and everyone was, running around like crazy and sanitizing and signage and all sorts of things. And I think it's absolutely, lots of people having soap and towels, like a hand washing kit in every truck so that staff could use a customer's tap and wash their hands. And are all those things still happening? I don't know, but it would be great to know and to encourage everyone to stay on board. So, Joe Slummy, any comment from you on behalf of LO's COVID task force? Lindsay Ross, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I know you've been one of the warriors of the COVID task force. We're just going to wrap up. It's 1 o'clock. And so Joe and Lindsay Ross, I'll just invite you both to make a comment as we close off here.
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. And I would echo exactly what Brian had typed into the chat. Comes down to culture and building it into your everyday habit. It's something that is part of every single COVID-19 task force meeting. And we just had meeting 137. It is about making sure that the Don't Let Your Guard Down campaign doesn't lose steam. And I mean, it has, and people start to get complacent and comfortable and all those things. And so, yeah, I think a refresh is warranted, and we need to come out full stop on that kind of campaign with not letting your guard down. I mean, we've all kind of seen it, and I think the example of the inventory of spray 9 and not having to worry about it because we stopped that a long time ago. The practices at the Landscape Ontario office are the exact same from when we implemented them. Anyone that is coming into the building, you have to fill out a form. And when you do come in, you have to take your temperature and sign in. So there's full tracking on who has been and when. Our cleaning practices have been adopted so that there's a deep clean all the time. And that's just our regular clean now. So all these practices have just become our new normal.
Good. I kind of hope they stay, because you know what? I don't remember the last time I came across anybody with the common cold.
Right.
Like I just don't, I don't remember, like I haven't had a cold in a year and a half. And I certainly don't remember coming across anybody that's had a cold or the flu. Nobody in a year. So I remember, I can't remember if it was June or May's Landscape Ontario magazine column that I write one every month, but one of the ones a year ago, I wrote about compliance versus complacency and how important it was to stay on the compliance side of COVID and not to become complacent. And so I think a refresh is really, really important. Lindsay Ross, can I ask you just to chime in here for a moment before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I would say, looking at our company, we have actually modified our protocols a bit based on, changing evidence and science. Certainly mask wearing is still part of our policy, distancing. Hand cleansing is part of our policy, but we've stopped, saturating every truck and trailer with bleach or cleanser every night, because at this point, the preponderance of the evidence is that COVID isn't easily spread on surfaces. So that kind of started to feel like COVID theater as opposed to actually achieving something. But we've kept up with having staff drive themselves around from site to site, paying them mileage. And I think that of everything we do actually helps keep it front of mind that we're still in different times. You know, because it's like, wait a second, why are we all driving ourselves around? Oh yeah, COVID's still a thing. And we still don't want a crew wiped out because somebody gets the Delta variant and suddenly everybody who works with them is a close contact. So,
Okay.
and I think Tony's wrong, by the way, Joe. I think we're at like 139 or 140. I think he missed a couple along the way.
But who's counting? Anyway, so I just want to say thank you to everyone. And Natalie, can I just invite you? You've been so quiet. And I just wanted to make sure that we haven't missed a question from you if you had.
No, thank you for asking. It's been really good to hear about what's going on. We have an office with no one in it, and all of this is relevant to so many people, whether you have crew trucks or a warehouse. It's a really good conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone. Amiri, bravo, much appreciated. Dominic, thank you so much for, as always, being a part of our peer conversations, but in particular today for bringing Amiri to us as a valuable legal resource. Very, very grateful for the input. And this recording will go on to the peer Facebook page and wherever else Joe Salemi tells me to put it.
Thank you all very much. You have a great day.
Okay,
Thank
be
you
well,
very much.
everyone.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.